In one of Manhattan's most prestigious towers, where million-dollar deals are decided every day, a woman works in the shadows, invisible to the eyes of executives who barely notice her. Grace cleans offices with the same precision she once used to teach international trade, her silent footsteps echoing through the marble halls where she was once respected. When a crucial $400 million deal is about to fall apart because of language barriers, Grace makes a choice that changes everything. She reveals she understands every word of Dutch the investors are exchanging. But Marcus Thompson, the Millionaire CEO, realizes her intervention is only the tip of the iceberg. Who is this mysterious woman, and why is someone with such linguistic expertise and business knowledge cleaning bathrooms in his building?
Hello. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. At the end, please rate the story. I will be happy to respond to you in the comments. Now, let's get to the story.
The morning sun streamed through the panoramic windows on the 42nd floor, bathing the luxurious corporate office of Thompson Industries in a golden light that made the marble finishes sparkle like precious jewels. The air conditioning kept the temperature at a perfect 70 degrees Fahrenheit, while the distant murmur of Manhattan traffic came through the tempered glass walls as a muffled whisper. Grace Williams moved silently down the main hallway. Her rubber-soled shoes made not a sound against the Italian marble floor. At 42 years old, Grace had mastered the art of invisibility, a skill essential for someone working in the shadows of a financial empire. Her hands, rough but delicate, held the cleaning cart with the same precision a surgeon uses with instruments. The office around her pulsed with business energy. Executives in $3,000 suits hurried through the halls, cell phones glued to their ears, discussing mergers and acquisitions in low but urgent tones. Grace watched everything with keen eyes, noting every detail as if she were a silent camera. She knew the vice president of marketing was nervous. His hands trembled slightly when he held his coffee. She also knew the chief financial officer had cried in the women's bathroom last Friday, as traces of mascara still lingered at the sink's edge. "Grace," murmured Jennifer Hayes, the executive secretary, approaching with a stack of documents in her arms. "Mr. Thompson needs the conference room spotless by 9:30. The European company's staff arrive at 10. Grace barely nodded, an almost imperceptible motion. "Yes, Ms. Hayes, it's almost done." Her voice was soft, cultivated through years of practice speaking only when necessary. Jennifer smiled briefly before disappearing down the hallway, her heels clicking against the marble in a way Grace's shoes never did. Marcus Thompson's office occupied the entire southeast corner of the building, a fortress of glass and mahogany with a breathtaking view of Central Park. Grace pushed her cart toward the massive double-wood doors, pausing for a moment to listen to voices inside. Marcus was on the phone, his deep authoritative voice slicing through the air like a sharp blade. "I don't care what the German lawyers are saying, Robert. I want that proposal on my desk by Tuesday, or I'll find someone who can get the job done." Grace knocked lightly on the door, waiting for permission before entering. The office was a sanctuary of power and wealth. Mahogany shelves lined with hardcover books, paintings by famous artists decorating the walls, and a desk the size of a ping-pong table that cost more than Grace earned in 2 years. Marcus Thompson stood by the window, a 50-year-old man with perfectly styled gray hair and a navy suit that sculpted his athletic silhouette. He didn't look at Grace as she entered, continuing his phone conversation while watching the city's movement below. Grace began her work with the silent efficiency she'd honed over 8 years at Thompson Industries. She knew exactly how long it would take to clean each surface, how to polish the mahogany without leaving streaks, and how to rearrange the papers on the desk without disturbing the specific order Marcus preferred. While cleaning the trophy shelf, Grace noticed one of the awards, a recognition for technological innovation, was slightly out of place. Marcus was meticulously organized, a man who noticed if a pen was tilted even a degree off. She adjusted the trophy delicately, her fingers barely touching the cold metal. "That's unacceptable." Marcus's voice suddenly exploded in the silence, making Grace pause for a split second. "I'm not paying you to bring me problems. I'm paying you to solve them." Grace continued her work, her movements fluid and almost meditative. She had long learned that the best way to navigate the corporate world was to become part of the furniture. Visible when necessary, invisible when convenient. The phone slammed down harder than needed, and Grace felt the shift in the office's atmosphere. Marcus finally turned, his blue-gray eyes scanning the room with the same intensity he used to analyze financial reports. "Are you finished here?" he asked, his voice now controlled but still tense. "Almost, Mr. Thompson," Grace replied softly, putting the cleaning spray back on the cart. "Just 5 more minutes." Marcus nodded shortly and walked toward the door, pausing only to adjust his tie knot in the window's reflection. Grace watched his rigid posture, how his shoulders stayed perfectly aligned even under pressure. She had wiped sweat stains from his shirts, seen piles of antacids in his desk drawer, but Marcus Thompson never let vulnerability show in public. When he left the office, Grace finished cleaning with her usual meticulous touch. She knew Marcus would return in exactly 15 minutes for one last inspection before the meeting. She also knew he would slightly move his daughter's photo frame, the only personal picture in the entire office, 2 inches to the left, a nervous habit repeated 3 times before he felt ready for any major negotiation. The main hallway was now buzzing with activity. Assistants rushed back and forth, carrying folders and coffee cups, while audiovisual technicians tested equipment in the conference room. Grace observed the familiar choreography of the corporate world, each person playing their part in the daily theater of business. "Grace!" Jennifer Hayes's voice cut through the buzz. "I need you to finish the conference room. Security staff are arriving for the final check." Grace pushed her cart down the corridor, passing executives who didn't even notice her presence. She was like a shadow moving through the building, watching everything, recording each detail, yet never truly seen. The main conference room was a show of discreet luxury. A mahogany conference table seating 20, Italian leather chairs costing more than Grace's monthly salary, and a panoramic view of Manhattan worth millions. Grace inspected every surface with trained eyes, adjusting the position of crystal water glasses and making sure every chair was perfectly aligned. While polishing the table, Grace noticed some papers forgotten beneath one of the chairs. She carefully picked them up, instantly recognizing Marcus's handwriting in the margin notes. They were strategies for the meeting negotiation points written in his angular, precise script. Grace placed the papers at the head of the table, exactly where Marcus would want to find them. The sound of elevators opening and closing echoed down the hall, mingling with murmurs in various languages. Grace finished her cleaning and silently pushed the cart out of the room, watching as assistants made last-minute adjustments to the presentation equipment. She paused in the hallway, observing the corporate ballet unfolding before her. In a few hours, millions of dollars would change hands in this room, decisions affecting thousands of jobs would be made, and she would be there, invisible as always, ensuring everything ran perfectly behind the scenes. Grace stored her supplies in the supply closet, her movements economical and precise. She knew her day was far from over. She would soon need to prepare the office for the next round of meetings, clean the waiting rooms where Japanese executives would wait, and make sure every detail was flawless for another day in Marcus Thompson's empire, as the building prepared to welcome its international visitors. Grace Williams continued her silent dance through the hallways, a constant, invisible presence at the beating heart of America's corporate world. The lobby of the Thompson Industries building had transformed into a stage for corporate diplomacy as the executive elevators opened their golden doors, revealing the first members of the European delegation. Grace watched discreetly from the adjacent hallway, organizing supplies in a closet while keeping a clear view of the reception area. Willem van der Berg stepped out of the central elevator like an imposing figure, his footsteps echoing across the marble with the confidence of someone used to commanding boardrooms in Amsterdam. At 55 years old, the Dutch investor radiated a quiet authority born from decades of building a financial empire spanning all of Europe. His charcoal gray suit was impeccably tailored, and his light blue eyes examined every detail of the environment with the precision of an expert appraiser. "Mr. van der Berg," Marcus Thompson's voice echoed through the lobby, loaded with calculated warmth. "Welcome to New York." Grace paused subtly in her movements, watching as Marcus approached the delegation with his characteristic posture. Shoulders relaxed but alert, a confident smile that didn't fully reach his eyes, and that particular way of extending his hand that showed respect without submission. "Marcus," van der Berg replied, his voice carrying a subtle Dutch accent that grew stronger on certain syllables. "I must admit your facilities are even more impressive than the photographs suggested." The delegation accompanying van der Berg was a mosaic of Europe's financial elite. Grace recognized some faces from the research she'd seen Marcus conduct the previous week, the German director Ingrid Hoffmann, whose blonde hair was pulled into a severe bun, and the French banker Pierre Dubois, whose dark eyes seemed to catalog every detail of the setting. "Allow me to introduce you to my team," Marcus said, gesturing elegantly toward the Thompson Industries executives lined up like a corporate honor guard. "This is Jonathan Rivers, my Vice President of International Operations, and Sarah Chun, our Director of Strategic Development." Grace moved silently down the hall, her hands busy organizing printed documents, but her ears tuned to every nuance of the conversation. She had learned that the most important deals often began with these subtle dances of courtesy, where every gesture and vocal inflection carried layers of meaning. "The proposal you sent is fascinating," commented Ingrid Hoffmann, her voice precise and measured, "especially the projection for the Asian market. Our analysts were particularly impressed with the numbers for the planned expansion." Marcus nodded, and Grace noticed the way his fingers twitched almost imperceptibly, a nervous signal she had seen only during the most crucial negotiations. This was no ordinary deal. It was the kind that could define a company's legacy. $350 million? Grace thought, recalling the figure she had seen scribbled in Marcus's handwriting on a paper forgotten in his office trash. She knew this was the initial offer, but also that Marcus was ready to negotiate up to $420 million, a number circled in red in his private notes. "Gentleman, lady," Marcus said, extending his arm toward the elevators. "How about we head upstairs so you can get a better view of what we're building together?" As the group moved toward the executive elevators, Grace adjusted her position, pretending to check the hallway sound system while observing the delegation's body language. Vanderberg kept a neutral expression, but Grace noticed his eyes lingered on the building's architectural details. The golden moldings, the crystal chandeliers, the marble finishes. He was a man who understood that the physical environment spoke as much as any PowerPoint presentation. The group disappeared into the elevator, and Grace made her way to the 42nd floor via the service elevator. She knew Marcus would first lead the visitors through his personal office, a not-so-subtle display of power and success, before taking them to the main conference room. On the executive floor, Grace positioned herself strategically near Marcus's office, arranging potted plants while keeping her ears alert. Voices filtered softly through the walls, but she caught fragments of the conversation. "The European market accounts for only 20% of our projected growth." Marcus's voice came through the door. "The real potential lies in the Asian expansion, where our technologies can revolutionize." Grace noticed Jennifer Hayes was visibly nervous, checking and rechecking her agenda, pacing back and forth in the hallway. The executive assistant had worked many high-stakes deals, but Grace could see from the tense lines around her eyes that this one was different. "Grace," Jennifer whispered, approaching quickly, "I need you to check the conference room one more time. Everything has to be absolutely perfect. Water glasses, pens, even the temperature. Mr. Thompson wants it exactly at 69 degrees. Grace nodded silently and headed to the conference room, where technicians made final adjustments to presentation equipment. The state-of-the-art projection screen glowed softly, displaying the Thompson Industries logo in blue and gold. Grace checked every chair, every crystal water glass, every notepad placed with mathematical precision as she adjusted the thermostat. She heard the familiar sound of the elevators opening again. Marcus was bringing the delegation up to the meeting floor, and Grace could feel the electric tension in the air. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, when months of preparation would crystallize into a few crucial hours of negotiation. Grace positioned herself in a nearby alcove outside the conference room, organizing office supplies in a glass-doored cabinet that offered a discreet view of the main hallway. She watched as Marcus personally guided Vanderberg and his team, pointing out various architectural features and sharing anecdotes about the company's history. This corridor was designed by the same architect who created the Four Seasons lobby, Marcus said, his voice brimming with genuine pride. We wanted every visitor to immediately feel the quality and attention to detail that define our company. Vanderberg smiled approvingly, but Grace noticed his eyes remained analytical, cataloging every visible expense as indicators of Thompson Industries' financial health. Pierre Dubois made discreet notes in a small leather notebook, while Ingrid Hoffmann subtly photographed some framed documents on the walls. Well, Marcus said, stopping in front of the double doors to the conference room. This is where the magic happens. Our main conference room, where some of the most important decisions in the company's history have been made. Grace watched as Marcus opened the doors with a theatrical gesture, revealing the impeccably prepared room. Natural light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows, creating an atmosphere that was both professional and inspiring. The high-definition monitors displayed graphs and projections Grace had seen Marcus obsessively review all week. "Impressive," Vanderberg murmured, his eyes scanning the Manhattan skyline that stretched beyond the windows. "You certainly know how to create an environment conducive to great decisions." Marcus smiled, and Grace noticed this time the smile genuinely reached his eyes. This was his element, the mix of power, strategy, and presentation that had defined his career. She watched as he gestured elegantly for the guests to take their seats, every move calculated to convey confidence and control. "Before we begin," Marcus said, standing at the head of the table, "I want to express my personal gratitude for you flying all the way here. I know everyone's time is extraordinarily valuable, and the fact that you've dedicated these days to our proposal demonstrates the kind of serious partnership we're looking to build." Grace noticed Vanderberg settled in the chair directly opposite Marcus, a strategic choice allowing direct eye contact throughout the presentation. The other delegates arranged themselves to create an interesting visual dynamic, with Marcus clearly the center of attention but without physically dominating the space. Jennifer Hayes entered quietly, distributing leather folders containing copies of the presentations and supplementary documents. Grace observed the familiar choreography of last-minute preparations. Water glasses repositioned, pens checked, air conditioning adjusted to maintain perfect comfort. "Gentleman, lady," Marcus said, his voice adopting the professional tone Grace had come to recognize as his negotiating mode. "Let's start with an overview of where we are today and where we intend to go together." Grace stepped away silently from her observation post, knowing her presence was no longer needed or appropriate during the formal meeting. But as she moved down the hall, she carried with her every detail she had observed: the micro-expressions, the nervous gestures, the subtle signals that revealed the true intentions behind diplomatic courtesies. The fate of Thompson Industries was now in Marcus Thompson's hands, and Grace knew the next few hours would determine not only the success of this specific deal, but the future of the entire company and everyone who depended on it. Marcus's presentation flowed like a well-rehearsed symphony, each slide advancing with precise timing as his voice filled the conference room with the confidence earned from decades of successful negotiations. Grace watched discreetly from the adjacent hallway, adjusting flowers in a vase while keeping her ears tuned to the meeting's rhythm. As you can see on the chart on page 15, Marcus gestured elegantly toward the screen, where impressive figures shimmered in blue and gold. Our conservative projection indicates a 28% return on investment in the first fiscal year. Willem Vanderberg nodded thoughtfully, his fingers gently drumming against the leather of his briefcase as he reviewed the documents. Ingrid Hoffman took precise notes in her angular handwriting, and Pierre Dubois murmured occasional approvals in French, creating an atmosphere of genuine interest that made Marcus's shoulders relax imperceptibly. "Very impressive," Vanderberg commented, his voice heavy with professional admiration, "especially considering the current fluctuations in the Asian market. You clearly did your homework." Marcus smiled, and Grace noticed his hands moving more fluidly now, the morning's nervous gestures replaced by the assurance of a man who felt success within reach. The meeting was progressing exactly as he had planned, every anticipated objection and calibrated response building momentum toward closing the deal. "That brings us to the crucial point," Marcus said, moving to the next slide, where the contract terms appeared in detailed legal formatting. "The intellectual property framework we're proposing offers maximum flexibility for our European partners, while maintaining security protocols that comply with both U.S. regulations and European Union guidelines." Then Grace noticed a subtle change in Vanderberg's posture. His eyes narrowed slightly as he leaned forward, examining a specific section of the document with renewed intensity. He raised his hand, interrupting Marcus mid-sentence. "Excuse me, Marcus," Vanderberg said, his voice polite but carrying a new urgency. "I need to clarify something about Clause 4.7 regarding sublicensing rights." Marcus nodded, waiting for the question, But Vanderberg abruptly turned to his colleagues and began speaking rapidly in Dutch, his voice low but intense. "This is exactly what I feared. Look at this clause. They retain all sublicensing rights for the Asian markets." Grace observed as Marcus's expression shifted subtly, a furrow of confusion appearing between his eyebrows. She had seen that look before during meetings with international clients, but never at such a critical moment. Ingrid Hoffman responded quickly in Dutch, her voice low but clearly displeased. "Yes, and look here, paragraph 6.2. If disputes arise, we have almost no legal protection." Marcus cleared his throat discreetly, trying to regain control of the conversation. "Gentlemen, if there are specific concerns about these clauses, I'd be happy to clarify." But Vanderberg continued his discussion in Dutch, now gesturing emphatically to Pierre Dubois, who leaned in to examine the document more closely. "Pierre, what do you think? In France, have you encountered similar clauses?" Pierre replied in French, his words fast and technical, but Grace could see from his body language that he was expressing similar concerns. The atmosphere in the room shifted drastically, the positive energy draining away like air from a deflating balloon. Marcus tried once more. "Perhaps we can discuss these issues in English, so I can address your concerns directly?" Vanderberg looked at him as if suddenly remembering his presence, but immediately resumed the conversation in Dutch with renewed intensity. "We need to thoroughly discuss this before moving forward. These terms could be disastrous for our interests." Grace watched as panic began to seep into Marcus's expression. His hands, which a moment ago had gestured confidently, now rested in discreet fists on the table. She knew he was mentally reviewing his options. Where was his official translator? Dr. Heinrich Müller was supposed to have arrived the previous morning, but Grace vaguely recalled Jennifer Hayes mentioning a canceled flight. "Excuse me for a moment," Marcus said, his voice maintaining professional composure but carrying an undercurrent of barely concealed desperation. He stood and walked to the window, discreetly pulling out his cell phone. Grace observed Marcus typing a message rapidly, probably to Jennifer Hayes, his fingers moving with mounting urgency. She saw in the window's reflection that his jaw was tight, a rigid line that appeared only when he struggled to maintain control in situations slipping beyond his grasp. Meanwhile, the Dutch discussion continued, now with all three European investors actively participating. Grace noticed their gestures grew more animated, their voices more urgent, and their body language suggested they were identifying significant problems with the proposal. "I think we need more time to evaluate this," Vanderberg said, his voice carrying a determination that made Grace wince inwardly. She didn't understand Dutch, but years of watching negotiations had taught her to recognize the universal tones of hesitation and resistance. Marcus returned to the table, his professional smile firmly in place, but Grace could see the thin sweat forming on his forehead despite the room's controlled temperature. "Apologies for the interruption. My official translator is temporarily unavailable, but perhaps we could continue in English." Vanderberg exchanged glances with his colleagues before replying, "Of course, Marcus, but please understand that some of these legal matters are extremely complex, and we prefer to discuss them in our native language to ensure absolute precision." "Naturally," Marcus answered, but Grace saw his hands tremble slightly as he reached for his glass of water. "Maybe we can schedule a follow-up session when my translator is available?" The suggestion hung in the air like toxic smoke. Grace watched as Vanderberg discreetly checked his watch, a Patek Philippe worth more than Grace earned in 3 years. The gesture was small but loaded with meaning. Time is money, and delays signal organizational incompetence. "We have limited time here in New York," Vanderberg murmured to Ingrid Hoffman, his voice low but clearly audible in the tense silence of the room. Marcus tried again. "Perhaps I could have Jonathan Rivers here to clarify some of the legal issues? He has extensive experience with international contracts." But even as he made the suggestion, Grace sensed Marcus knew he was losing ground. The room's dynamic had fundamentally shifted. He was no longer in control, no longer setting the negotiation's pace. Instead, he was reacting, improvising, desperately trying to regain a position lost the moment the investors began speaking Dutch. Vanderberg leaned back in his chair, his eyes studying Marcus with a new, calculated intensity. "Marcus, I appreciate your flexibility, but these contractual issues are fundamental to our decision. We cannot proceed without a full and precise understanding. The silence that followed was deafening. Grace watched as Marcus visibly struggled with the situation, his eyes quickly scanning the faces of the investors, searching for signs of openness or opportunity. But all she saw was the politely distant expression of people who had already made their decision, even though they hadn't yet voiced it. "Could we continue this conversation after lunch?" Vanderberg asked his colleagues, his voice casual but with an undertone of finality that made Grace's stomach tighten in sympathy for Marcus. Marcus remained seated at the head of the table, his dreams of $420 million evaporating into the air-conditioned conference room, as a conversation he could not understand decided the fate of his empire. Grace watched from the hallway as the tension in the conference room grew almost tangible, like an electric storm about to explode. Through the glass walls, she could see Marcus sitting stiffly at the head of the table, his fingers nervously tapping against the leather of his briefcase, while the Dutch investors continued their quiet but intense discussion. Jennifer Hayes appeared beside her, carrying a silver tray with a new crystal water pitcher. "Grace," she whispered, her voice heavy with anxiety, "I need you to go in and refill the waters, discreetly. Mr. Thompson he's having some trouble." Grace nodded silently, adjusting her posture and adopting the neutral expression she had perfected over months of invisible work. She took the tray from Jennifer's hands, feeling the weight of the expensive crystal and the responsibility of the moment. Every step toward the conference room door seemed amplified, though she moved with the same silent grace that had always characterized her work. The door opened with a soft whisper, and Grace entered the room with the economical movements of someone trained to be seen but not noticed. The air was thick with tension, every breath seeming to echo in the awkward silence that had settled. She began her familiar routine, moving around the table with choreographed precision, refilling each glass with the exact amount of cold water. As she worked, her ears automatically caught fragments of conversation continuing in Dutch. Vanderberg was saying, "The biggest problem is paragraph 8.3 about environmental impact. This clause almost gives them carte blanche for expansion without adequate environmental protection." Grace paused imperceptibly as she removed Ingrid Hoffman's empty glass, processing the words. She knew that section of the contract. She had seen Marcus obsessively reviewing it the previous week, trying to balance operational flexibility with environmental responsibility. Clause 8.3 was actually more restrictive than most similar contracts, but the legal terminology could be confusing to anyone not familiar with the nuances of American environmental regulations. "Precisely," Ingrid Hoffman replied, her fingers pointing to a specific section of the document. "And if stricter environmental laws come into effect in the future, who will be responsible for the compliance costs?" Grace continued her work, but her hands now moved with an automatic lightness while her mind processed what she had heard. She knew Marcus had spent weeks with his legal team specifically addressing these environmental concerns. The language seemed vague on the surface, but in reality, it included specific protections that the investors simply weren't seeing. Pierre Dubois joined the discussion. "And what about liability for future damages? This clause seems to put all the risk on us." Grace discreetly glanced at Marcus, who was sitting with an expression of growing despair, clearly realizing he was losing control of the most important situation of his career. His hands were now pressed firmly against the table, knuckles white with tension. She could see sweat forming on his forehead despite the perfectly controlled room temperature. For a moment, Grace hesitated. Her instructions had always been clear. Stay invisible, don't interfere, maintain absolute professional discretion. But watching Marcus struggle against a language barrier that threatened to undo months of work, she felt something stir in her chest, a compassion that outweighed her professional duties. Grace quietly approached Marcus's chair, leaning slightly as if adjusting something on the table. "Mr. Thompson," she whispered, her voice so low that only he could hear, "can I help you?" Marcus looked up, surprised by the interruption. Grace could see the confusion on his face. Cleaning staff did not offer assistance in $400 million negotiations. "How?" he murmured, his voice heavy with disbelief. "I understand Dutch," Grace replied simply. keeping her voice low and her eyes respectfully focused on the table. "I can help with the translation, if you allow me." The silence that followed felt eternal. Grace could feel Marcus studying her face, searching for signs that she was joking or lying. In his eyes, she saw the conflict between skepticism and desperation, the struggle of a man with no other options. "You," Marcus began, his voice so low it was almost a whisper. "You really speak Dutch?" Grace nodded almost imperceptibly, waiting for his decision. She knew she was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed, but something in Marcus's expression, the vulnerability behind his confident facade, compelled her to act. Marcus looked toward the investors, who had paused their discussion and were watching the whispered exchange with growing curiosity. Vanderberg frowned, clearly intrigued by the quiet conference between the CEO and the cleaning staff. "All right," Marcus said finally, his voice tinged with a mix of hope and resignation. "All right." Grace straightened up, adjusting her posture and adopting a more formal expression. She turned to Willem Vanderberg, who watched her with growing interest, and spoke in clear, fluent Dutch. "Mr. Vanderberg, my apologies for the interruption. I'm Grace, and I work here in the building. Mr. Thompson asked me to assist with communication about the contract terms." The silence that followed was absolute. Grace could feel everyone's gaze in the room, but she maintained her focus respectfully on Vanderberg, awaiting his response. She had chosen her words carefully, presenting herself with appropriate humility while establishing her linguistic credibility. Vanderberg leaned forward, his eyes examining Grace with new, respectful intensity. "Your Dutch is excellent," he said slowly, his voice filled with genuine surprise. "Where did you learn it?" "I lived in the Netherlands for a while," Grace replied simply, offering no further explanation. "I understand you have concerns about the environmental impact clauses in paragraph 8.3? Ingrid Hoffman leaned forward, her eyes shining with renewed interest. "Yes, exactly. The wording seems very vague, and we are worried about our liability." Grace nodded understandingly, her hands moving delicately as she processed not just the words, but the legal nuances behind them. "I fully understand your concerns. May I explain how this clause actually works within the American legal system?" Marcus watched in stunned silence, his mind struggling to process what he was witnessing. The woman he had seen clean his office hundreds of times, who had spent months practically invisible, was now leading a complex legal discussion in fluent Dutch. Not just fluent, sophisticated, technical, demonstrating a deep understanding of both the language and the legal concepts being discussed. "The clause seems vague," Grace continued, her voice maintaining a respectful but confident tone. "But it's actually designed to comply with specific EPA requirements. When it says reasonable environmental standards, it refers to Title 40 of the Code of Federal Regulations, which actually sets stricter standards than most international contracts require." Vanderberg exchanged glances with Ingrid Hoffman, both clearly impressed not only by Grace's language skills, but also by her technical understanding of the contract terms. Pierre Dubois leaned forward, eyes bright with renewed interest. "Interesting," Vanderberg murmured, quickly leafing through the document. "Can you elaborate on this further?" Grace nodded, respectfully stepping closer to the table. "Of course. If you look at the footnotes on page 23, Marcus continued watching in absolute silence, his mind replaying every interaction he'd had with Grace over the months. Every time she silently organized his documents, every moment she quietly worked around his meetings, every polite greeting he'd answered distractedly. Who was this woman? And why was she working as a cleaner when she clearly possessed skills rivaling his own international consultants? The realization hit Marcus like a cold wave. He knew absolutely nothing about Grace, except that she cleaned well and showed up to work on time. Now, watching her navigate effortlessly through complex legal terminology in a language he didn't know she spoke, he began to wonder what other surprises this mysterious woman might be hiding. Grace positioned herself strategically between the two sides of the table, her posture reflecting a subtle but profound transformation. Where moments before she had moved with the studied discretion of an invisible employee, now she carried the silent authority of an experienced negotiator, every gesture calculated to build a bridge between two worlds of business expectations. "Mr. Vanderberg," she said, her voice respectful yet adopting a more formal cadence, "I understand your primary concern is the potential costs of future environmental compliance. In the American legal system, this works differently than in Europe." Vanderberg leaned forward, his eyes studying Grace with renewed intensity. It was clear he was completely reassessing his view of the situation. "Yes, exactly. In the Netherlands, we are used to much more specific environmental legislation from the start." Grace nodded understandingly, then turned to Marcus, her English flowing with the same natural ease. "Mr. Thompson, Mr. Vanderberg is concerned about future environmental compliance costs. In the Dutch system, regulations are typically more specific from the outset, so the language we use seems vague to them." Marcus watched fascinated as Grace navigated between the two languages. But even more impressive was how she seemed to instinctively understand the underlying cultural differences. She wasn't just translating words. She was translating expectations, contexts, even styles of business communication. "That makes sense," Marcus replied, his voice filled with growing admiration. "How can we address that concern?" Grace turned back to Vanderberg, her hands moving delicately to indicate specific sections of the document. "Mr. Vanderberg, would it help if we added an addendum specifically referencing EPA standards? That would give you the assurance you're looking for while maintaining the operational flexibility Mr. Thompson needs." Ingrid Hoffman leaned in to examine the documents more closely, her expression showing genuine interest instead of earlier suspicion. "That's an interesting approach. Can you tell us how that would work in practice?" Grace nodded, moving gracefully around the table to point to specific sections. "Of course, if we look at paragraph 8.3, we can modify it to explicitly reference Title 40, Section 1502 of the Code of Federal Regulations. This gives you a specific legal standard to refer to." Marcus watched in silent amazement as Grace demonstrated not just linguistic fluency but a deep knowledge of American environmental regulations rivaling that of his own legal advisors. Where had she learned this? And why did he know nothing about her background? Furthermore, Grace continued, her voice adopting the confident rhythm of someone completely comfortable with complex technical material. "In the United States, there is a trend toward stricter environmental regulation. By referring now to these standards, you protect yourself against future changes." Vanderberg exchanged looks with Pierre Dubois, both clearly impressed by Grace's depth of knowledge.
Interesting perspective, Van der Berg murmured.
"And what about liability for cleanup costs?" Grace paused thoughtfully, processing not just the technical question but the cultural implications behind it. "That's an important question. In Europe, you're used to joint liability systems. Here in America, we work more with compartmentalized liability." She turned to Marcus, translating not just the words but the cultural context. "Mr. Thompson, they are accustomed to shared liability systems in Europe. We need to clarify how our compartmentalized liability structure would work in practice." Marcus nodded, beginning to realize that Grace was offering far more than translation. She was providing cultural insights that his international business consultants cost thousands of dollars to supply. "Tell them we can create a dedicated reserve fund for environmental issues." Grace translated but added her own refinement. "Mr. Thompson proposes establishing a specific environmental guarantee fund. This is similar to the system Shell uses for their international joint ventures. Would this be an acceptable approach?" The mention of Shell clearly resonated with the Dutch investors. Vanderberg leaned back, his expression visibly softening. "Ah, I know that system. Yes, that would relieve many of our concerns." Grace noted the shift in the room's dynamic and gently pressed the advantage. "I could also suggest we add a clause for annual environmental audits by an independent third party. This is standard practice in many American contracts and would give you additional assurance." Ingrid Hoffman took quick notes. Her earlier hostility completely vanished. "That's an excellent proposal. Which audit firms would qualify for that?" "Firms like Ernst & Young or Deloitte have specialized environmental audit divisions." Grace answered without hesitation. "They are familiar with both American and European standards." Marcus watched in total fascination as Grace demonstrated knowledge about international auditing firms, environmental compliance practices, and even joint venture procedures he himself had had to research extensively for this negotiation. Each of her answers revealed layers of expertise that seemed impossible for someone he had categorized as just cleaning staff. Pierre Dubois, who had remained mostly silent, finally spoke up. "Mademoiselle Grace, your understanding of European regulations is remarkable. Have you worked in the international field before?" Grace responded in flawless French, her pronunciation impeccable. "I've had the opportunity to work with several international organizations. That gave me a unique perspective on different regulatory systems." The answer was diplomatic, providing enough information to establish credibility without revealing specific details about her past. Marcus noted how skillfully she navigated personal questions, keeping the focus on solving the contractual issues. "Now," Grace continued, returning to Dutch, "let's look at paragraph 12.4 on dispute resolution. I think there is a misunderstanding about how arbitration works in the American system." She expertly guided the discussion through the contract's most technical points, her voice maintaining a collaborative tone that gradually dissolved the tense atmosphere that had dominated the room. Marcus watched as the investors' expressions shifted from suspicion to interest, from hesitation to genuine trust. "Grace," Vanderberg said finally, using her name for the first time with clear respect, "your explanation has largely alleviated our concerns. Could you assist with drafting these amendments?" Grace looked at Marcus, silently asking for permission before replying. Marcus nodded, still processing the complete transformation he had witnessed. "Of course," Grace answered. "I would be happy to help ensure both parties are satisfied with the final terms." Over the next hour, Grace facilitated a detailed discussion about specific contract modifications, her expertise evident in every suggestion. She proposed language that satisfied European concerns while maintaining the operational flexibility Marcus needed, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of both legal and business aspects of the negotiation. When they finally reached agreement on the revised terms, Vanderberg stood and extended his hand to Grace. "Grace, I want to personally thank you. Without your help, we probably wouldn't have reached an agreement." Ingrid Hoffman nodded vigorously. "Yes, your diplomatic approach and expertise made this possible. It was a pleasure working with you." Pierre Dubois added in English, clearly wanting Marcus to understand as well. "Grace, your intervention saved this negotiation. We are truly grateful for your professionalism and insight." Marcus remained seated, watching as three of Europe's most sophisticated investors expressed genuine gratitude to the woman he had seen as just one more invisible employee. The realization was slowly dawning in his mind. He had been working in the same building for months with someone whose skills and knowledge surpassed many of the consultants he paid fortunes to hire. Grace responded to the expressions of gratitude with graceful humility, but Marcus could see in her eyes a quiet satisfaction, not from recognition, but from successfully resolving a complex problem. It was the expression of someone who had found purpose in using her skills to create a solution that benefited everyone involved. As the investors gathered their documents and prepared for the lunch break, Marcus kept watching Grace, his mind buzzing with questions demanding urgent answers. The last echo of the Dutch investor's footsteps faded down the hallway, leaving Marcus and Grace alone in the conference room. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with an electric tension that made the air between them seem to hum. Marcus stayed seated at the head of the table, his hands pressed against the leather of his briefcase, trying to process what he had just witnessed. "Grace," he finally said, his voice sounding oddly hoarse. Can you stay? Please." Grace nodded silently, still holding the crystal tray, but her posture had shifted subtly. She no longer carried the bowed, deferential stance of an invisible employee. Instead, she stood tall, shoulders squared, a natural dignity radiating from every movement. It was as if a mask had been lifted, revealing someone completely different underneath. Marcus rose slowly, his movements stiff and uncertain. He began walking around the table, his footsteps echoing on the polished marble floor, each sound amplified in the heavy silence of the room. His mind struggled to connect the image of the woman who had just saved his $400 million deal with the familiar figure he saw every morning, quietly emptying trash bins and wiping down surfaces. Marcus started, then stopped, running a hand through his hair. I'm trying to understand what the hell just happened here. Grace remained still, watching him with calm, patient eyes. She carefully placed the tray on the table, her movements deliberate and graceful. Mr. Thompson, she said softly, I just offered help when I saw you were struggling. Help, Marcus repeated, his voice rising an octave. Grace, you just led a complex international negotiation in 3 languages. You demonstrated knowledge of environmental regulations that rivals my corporate lawyers. That's not help. That's... He gestured vaguely, searching for the words. That's executive-level expertise. The weight of realization started to settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. Marcus stopped pacing and turned to face her directly. So, who are you really, Grace? Because you're clearly not who I thought you were. Grace kept her serene expression, but Marcus saw something shift in her eyes. A readiness, as if she were bracing for a conversation she had anticipated but feared. I am Grace, she answered simply. I work here in the building. No, Marcus interrupted, his voice echoing against the glass walls. Don't give me that. Women who work cleaning offices don't speak fluent Dutch. They don't understand international joint ventures. They don't know EPA regulations by heart. His voice was rising, years of assumptions shattering in real time. Grace didn't back down from his intensity. Instead, she held her ground, her dignity intact even when faced with his explosive frustration. Mr. Thompson, she said, her voice maintaining a respectful tone but gaining subtle firmness. People are not defined solely by their current jobs. The response hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He sank heavily into a chair, his hands covering his face. My God, he murmured through his fingers. How many times have you seen me struggle with problems you could have fixed easily? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with uncomfortable implications. Marcus recalled all the mornings he'd arrived at the office stressed over international contract issues, while Grace worked silently around him, seemingly unaware of his struggles. Now he realized she probably understood his problems better than he did. Months? Marcus continued, his voice thick with disbelief. Months you've been here, watching, cleaning around documents you clearly understood, and I never even asked your last name. Grace stayed quiet, letting him absorb the implications of what he'd discovered. Marcus lifted his eyes to meet hers and was struck by the calm composure she maintained. There was no accusation in her expression, no bitterness about being ignored or underestimated. There was only quiet patience, as if she was waiting for him to reach his own conclusions. Why? Marcus finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why are you working as... He gestured helplessly, unable to finish the sentence without sounding condescending. As a janitor? Grace finished for him, her voice showing no sign of offense. Because I needed a job, Mr. Thompson. And this job was offered to me. Marcus shook his head, growing even more frustrated by the non-answer. That doesn't explain anything. Women with your background, whatever it is, don't end up cleaning offices. Not without a reason. Grace took a deep breath, and Marcus could see something resigning in her expression. It was as if she was reaching a decision she had avoided for a long time. Mr. Thompson, she said, her voice taking on a different quality. More formal, more distant. You're right. There's more to my story than it seems. Marcus leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. Then tell me, because I need to understand how I could have been so blind, so arrogant about who you were. Grace studied him for a long moment, perhaps gauging if he was truly ready to hear the truth. Marcus could see the weight of the decision in her eyes, the struggle between the instinct to protect her privacy and the need to provide some explanation for what he'd witnessed. Are you sure you want to know? Grace asked gently. Because once I tell you, you won't be able to go back and see me as just the woman who cleans your office. Marcus nodded vigorously, his curiosity and confusion creating an urgent need to understand. I need to know, Grace. After what happened here today, I need to know who you really are. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, as if preparing to revisit memories she'd rather keep buried. When she opened them again, Marcus could see a quiet resolve settling over her features. "All right," she said, her voice taking on a more personal tone than he had ever heard before. "But maybe you want to sit down. This isn't a simple story." Marcus was already seated, but he adjusted himself in the chair, his attention fully focused on Grace. Everything else, the successful negotiation, the satisfied investors, even the financial implications of the deal, faded from his mind. In this moment, there was only the woman standing before him, about to reveal a truth he was beginning to suspect would fundamentally change how he saw the world. Grace took a deep breath, her shoulders straightening even more, and Marcus could see that she was preparing to remove the final layer of disguise she had kept for so long. Grace moved slowly to one of the chairs at the conference table, her movements deliberate and measured. She sat down with the same natural elegance she had shown during the negotiation. But now Marcus could see a subtle vulnerability in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She folded her hands in her lap, staring at them for a moment before lifting her eyes to meet his. "My full name is Dr. Grace Williams," she began, her voice holding the soft, controlled tone he had come to know, but now carrying a different weight. "I was a tenured professor of linguistics and international relations at Columbia University." Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. Columbia University. He knew the reputation of the institution, the prestige that came with a tenured position there. "Were?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "For 12 years, Grace continued, a faint nostalgic smile touching her lips. "I taught Dutch, German, and French, but my real specialty was European business culture. I spent my summers in Amsterdam, Berlin, and Paris, researching how cultural differences affected international negotiations." Marcus leaned forward, fascinated and simultaneously horrified. The woman he had seen every morning, quietly emptying trash bins and wiping surfaces, had been an internationally recognized expert in the exact area he struggled to navigate. "I also did consulting," Grace went on, her voice taking on a livelier tone as she recalled her former life. "Big corporations hired me when expanding into European markets. I helped them understand not just the linguistic nuances, but the cultural expectations that could make or break a deal." She paused, looking out the conference room window at the cityscape beyond. "I had an apartment on the Upper West Side, just 3 blocks from campus. It wasn't large, but it had a beautiful view of Central Park. I could walk to work in the mornings, stop by the corner cafe where the barista knew my order by heart." Marcus could perfectly picture the life she was describing, a comfortable, respectable existence, the kind of life that matched the level of sophistication and knowledge she had displayed. You loved teaching?" he asked, unable to keep a note of reverence out of his voice. Grace's eyes genuinely lit up for the first time since she had started telling her story. "Oh, yes," she replied, her voice full of passion. "Especially the undergrad courses on international business culture. I had students from all over the world, each bringing their own perspective. We would do negotiation simulations, just like the one you just witnessed." Marcus shook his head slowly, the weight of her accomplishments settling over him like a physical burden. "So when you stepped in today, I was doing what I did for over a decade," Grace finished, "helping build bridges between different business cultures. It was like getting back on a bike, so to speak." "My God," Marcus murmured, covering his face with his hands. "I had an international expert on my payroll for months, and I had her cleaning bathrooms." Grace watched him with an expression part understanding, part sadness. "Mr. Thompson, you couldn't have known. I didn't say anything. But I should have realized," Marcus insisted, his voice heavy with guilt. "The way you spoke, your knowledge, how you carried yourself. There were signs." "There were," Grace agreed gently. "But people see what they expect to see. I wore a uniform, I cleaned, so I was a janitor. It's an understandable assumption." Marcus looked up, studying her face. "But it's not fair. To you, I mean, how did you end up?" He gestured helplessly, still struggling to phrase the question without sounding condescending. Grace took a deep breath, her fingers tightening slightly. How a Columbia professor ended up cleaning offices in Chicago, she finished for him. That's the hardest part of the story. Tell me, Marcus said softly. Please. Grace looked down at her hands again, and Marcus could see she was preparing to revisit memories that clearly caused her pain. I was good at what I did, she began. Very good. I was being considered for an endowed chair, which would have meant lifetime security, prestige, the chance to shape the next generation of international business experts. Her voice developed a distant quality, as if she was watching herself from afar. I had a life many people would envy. Regular international travel, academic recognition, students who respected me. I published in prestigious journals, spoke at conferences around the world. Marcus could hear the underlying pain in her voice, even as she spoke about her successes. That sounds like a wonderful life, he said carefully. It was, Grace replied, a sad smile playing on her lips. For a while, I thought I had it all figured out. I was young, successful, confident, maybe even a little arrogant about my own invincibility. She paused, and Marcus could see she was reaching the part of the story she had avoided telling. But you know how it is with lives that look perfect from the outside. Sometimes they're built on foundations more fragile than you realize. What happened, Grace? Marcus asked gently, his voice full of genuine concern. Grace closed her eyes for a moment, as if bracing herself for the hardest part of her narrative. When she opened them, Marcus could see a deep pain she had carefully kept hidden. I made a mistake, she said simply. A mistake that cost me everything. The silence settled between them, heavy with unspoken implications. Marcus could see that revealing this next part of the story would be like opening a wound that hadn't fully healed. You don't have to, he began, but Grace shook her head. No, I need to. After today, after what you saw, you deserve to know the whole truth. She took a deep breath, her shoulders straightening with determination. But you have to understand that what I'm about to tell you is something that destroyed not just my career, but my entire life. Marcus nodded solemnly, preparing for whatever was coming next. Grace watched him for a long moment, then closed her eyes again, as if readying herself to dive into waters she would rather avoid. Grace remained silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on a distant point through the conference room window. Marcus noticed her hands trembling slightly before she pressed them firmly against the table, as if bracing herself for what was to come. My husband died 3 years ago, she began, her voice so low Marcus had to lean forward to hear. David. He was an economics professor at NYU. Pancreatic cancer, it was very fast. 2 months from diagnosis to... She stopped, swallowing hard. Marcus felt a wave of sympathy but stayed silent, knowing she needed to tell her story at her own pace. His life insurance was substantial, Grace continued. $450,000. Along with our savings, which we'd built up over 15 years of steady academic careers, I had almost $700,000. For a college professor, that was financial security for life. Marcus could hear the bitterness growing in her voice, a pain deeper than just losing her husband. 6 months after the funeral, I was at a conference in Washington on international trade. There, I met a couple, Richard and Linda Hartwell. They seemed fascinated by my research, especially my work on emerging European markets. Richard said he ran an investment consulting firm that specialized in helping academics manage their finances. Grace laughed, but it was humorless. He said educators were overlooked by traditional financial advisors, that we needed someone who understood our mindset, our unique needs. He and Linda were so articulate, so knowledgeable. They quoted economic studies, used terminology I recognized from David's research. Marcus felt a knot forming in his stomach. He could see where this story was heading, and it hurt to see the pain in her eyes as she recalled it. They introduced me to other clients, all professors, all from prestigious universities. A physicist from Harvard, a history professor from Yale, a mathematician from Princeton. They all talked about the extraordinary returns they were getting, 15–20% a year. They said Richard had developed a proprietary algorithm that exploited inefficiencies in international markets. Grace paused, her hands clenched into fists. I should have known. I taught international business, how to spot fraudulent schemes. But I was grieving alone, and these people seemed genuinely interested in my well-being. You invested with them, Marcus said softly, not as a question. Everything, Grace replied, her voice breaking. Every penny. At first, it was just 100,000, but when the first returns came, when I saw statements showing substantial gains, I invested the rest. David's life insurance money, our savings, even a loan against my home. Marcus closed his eyes, feeling physical nausea at the betrayal she had suffered. It took 18 months for everything to collapse, Grace continued. When I finally tried to withdraw money for some home repairs, I found there was nothing. Not a cent. The company was completely fraudulent. Richard and Linda had disappeared, along with the funds of 230 university professors across the country. My God, Marcus murmured. The federal investigation was humiliating, Grace said, her voice taking on an emotional, heart-wrenching quality. My name appeared in newspapers, listed among the educated victims who were naive enough to fall for an obvious Ponzi scheme. The online comments were brutal. How could an international business professor be so stupid? How could someone who taught financial fraud be fooled so easily? Marcus saw tears welling in Grace's eyes, but she pressed on with fierce determination. I lost the house the next month. I couldn't pay the mortgage, had no savings to fall back on. I moved to a studio apartment in Queens, then to an even smaller one in the Bronx. But worse than the financial loss was what happened to my career. They fired you? Marcus asked, though he feared the answer. Not directly, but my reputation was destroyed. Students questioned how I could teach ethical business practices when I had been publicly humiliated by my own financial naivety. Colleagues avoided me in the hallways. I could see the pity in their eyes, mixed with a kind of horror, as if my misfortune was contagious. Grace wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, but her voice remained steady. When my contract ended, it wasn't renewed. Officially, it was due to department restructuring. Unofficially, my presence had become an embarrassment to the university. Did you try to find work elsewhere? Marcus asked, though he suspected he knew the answer. I tried everything, Grace said. I sent resumes to universities all over the country. When that didn't work, I tried community colleges, then high schools, then consulting firms. But every background check revealed the same thing. Dr. Grace Williams, the professor who was scammed out of $20 million in a Ponzi scheme. Marcus saw the pain deepen in her eyes as she continued. I was effectively blacklisted. Not for misconduct, not for incompetence, but for being a victim. It was as if my victimhood was a character flaw, proof I couldn't be trusted with educational responsibilities. So you came to Chicago? Marcus said, the pieces falling into place. I had no choice, Grace replied. My sister lives here in Evanston. She got me to stay on her couch for a few months, but I knew I couldn't impose indefinitely. I needed work, any work, and I needed it fast. Grace took a deep breath, and Marcus could see she was reaching the hardest part of the story. I started using just Grace Williams on job applications. Not Dr. Grace Williams, not mentioning Columbia, not mentioning my PhD. I hoped that without the academic credentials, people wouldn't make the connection to the news articles. But it was still hard to find work, Marcus observed. Impossible, Grace corrected him. I was overqualified for almost everything, and any position matching my real qualifications required extensive background checks. I was stuck in a vicious cycle. Too educated for basic jobs, too toxic for professional roles. Marcus shifted in his chair, uncomfortable with the raw injustice of what she described. After 3 months of rejections, I was facing the real possibility of homelessness. My sister was kind, but she has her own family, her own responsibilities. I couldn't keep relying on her charity. Grace looked directly at Marcus, and he saw both humiliation and determination in her eyes. That's when I saw the ad for the cleaning position here in the building. Immediate pay, no extensive background checks required, just basic references. My sister agreed to be a reference, describing me as a reliable domestic worker. Grace, Marcus began, but she shook her head. It wasn't the job I wanted, she said, her voice defensive. But it was the job I needed. It gave me a paycheck, let me rent a small apartment, gave me a reason to get out of bed every morning. After months of feeling completely useless, there was something invigorating about a job where I could see tangible results from my effort. Marcus leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the fall she had experienced. So you've been here for months listening to discussions about exactly the kinds of issues you used to teach. Yes, Grace replied quietly. But I was grateful to have a job. I was grateful to have survived. Grace stood up from her chair and walked to the window with measured steps. Marcus could see the tension in her shoulders as she looked out over the Chicago cityscape, perhaps seeing echoes of a different life in a different city. I wake up at 4:30 in the morning, she said, her voice taking on a more practical tone, as if reporting simple facts rather than a life of struggle. First, I clean an office complex in Cicero. I get there by 5:30. Then I come here at 8. At 2 in the afternoon, I work in a medical office in Rogers Park, and 3 times a week, I clean a gym in Lincoln Park until 9 at night. Marcus felt his stomach twist. You work how many hours a day? 14, 15 hours. Grace replied without turning from the window. It's what it takes to pay the rent on a 500-square-foot studio in a neighborhood where I'm not afraid to walk alone at night. $1,200 a month, plus utilities. For someone who once owned a 3-bedroom house overlooking Central Park, it's an adjustment. She paused, touching the window glass with her fingertips. But it's mine. I'm not depending on charity. I'm not crashing on anyone's couch. There's dignity in that, even when it's hard to remember at 3 in the morning when my alarm goes off. Marcus watched her reflection in the window, seeing both strength and exhaustion in her posture. How do you manage that? Physically, emotionally? Grace turned to face him, and Marcus saw a fierce determination in her eyes. I tell myself it's temporary. Every morning, as I put on my uniform, I tell myself today might be the day everything changes. That maybe someone will respond to one of my applications. That maybe my situation will improve. You still apply for teaching positions? Marcus asked, admiring her persistence. Religiously, Grace replied. Every night, after I get home, I spend an hour searching for opportunities. Community colleges, mostly some corporate training positions. I've customized hundreds of cover letters, tailored my resume a dozen different ways. I even considered leaving my PhD off entirely, pretending it never happened. Marcus heard the pain in her voice, the way she spoke about denying her own education and accomplishments. But even entry-level positions want explanations for employment gaps. And a 2-year gap is hard to explain without revealing the truth. So I keep applying, waiting, getting rejected. It's almost become a form of torture. But I can't stop. To stop would mean giving up entirely on who I was. Grace returned to the table, sitting down again with the same controlled grace. You want to know the hardest part? It's not the physical labor. It's not the long hours or the low pay. It's the invisibility. Invisibility? Marcus repeated. I spend my days surrounded by educated, professional people. People who talk about the same things I've studied for decades. I hear conversations about international politics, economic trends, exactly the kinds of cultural issues I could contribute to meaningfully. But to them, I'm just furniture. Someone who shows up, does a necessary job, and disappears. Marcus felt a pang of guilt, remembering countless times he had passed Grace in the halls without really seeing her. Some mornings, Grace continued, I listen to meetings through open doors. Yesterday, I heard a discussion about mergers between American and German companies. The participants were making basic mistakes about German business protocol, misunderstanding how corporate hierarchy works there. I wanted so much to just say something, offer insights that could have helped. But you couldn't, Marcus realized. Of course not. I was the janitor. Janitors don't interrupt corporate meetings with advice on international business. Doing that would be professional suicide. So I kept cleaning, pretending I didn't hear, pretending I didn't care. Marcus could see tears forming in her eyes, but Grace held them back with visible determination. I keep my mind sharp, she said, her voice growing stronger. Every night after work, I read the Financial Times, The Economist, Foreign Affairs. I keep up my language skills by watching French and German news online. I study economic reports, follow developments in international trade policy. Waiting for the day you can use that knowledge again, Marcus said softly. Waiting, Grace confirmed. Or maybe just refusing to let that part of me die completely. Some nights, I translate articles just to keep my skills alive. I analyze trends in European markets. I write essays no one will ever read about developments in transatlantic trade relationships. Marcus shook his head, overwhelmed by the waste of talent he was witnessing. This is criminal. What happened to you? The way you've been treated. It's not criminal, Grace corrected, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who's accepted an unfair reality. It's just life. Sometimes good people make bad choices. Sometimes they trust the wrong people. And sometimes the consequences are harsher than anyone deserves. But you didn't do anything wrong, Marcus insisted, feeling anger rise inside him. You were a victim and then you got punished for being a victim. That's not right. Grace studied him with an expression part appreciation, part sadness. Fairness is a luxury I can no longer afford to contemplate. I focus on survival, on keeping my dignity intact, on finding purpose in whatever work I'm doing. But you shouldn't have to. Mr. Thompson, Grace interrupted gently. I learned that should is a dangerous word. I should have been more careful with my investments. I should have trusted less. Academic institutions should support their faculty through personal crises. Employers should look beyond surface-level scandal to see real character. She paused, her eyes holding his with quiet intensity. But focusing on should leads to bitterness. I choose to focus on is and can be, what my life is now, and what it can become if I keep working, keep trying, keep hoping. Marcus leaned forward, struck by the quiet strength in her voice. How do you maintain such grace through all this? Grace smiled, and for the first time since she began her story, it was a genuine smile. Want to know a secret? Some mornings, when I'm cleaning these offices, I pretend I'm preparing for an important international meeting, that I'm creating the perfect environment for negotiations that could change the world. It's a silly fantasy, but it helps me find pride in the work. It's not silly, Marcus said firmly. It's beautiful and incredibly strong. Grace stood again, this time with a purpose that suggested her story was coming to a close. I survived, Mr. Thompson. I lost everything I thought defined who I was, but I survived. And today, for the first time in 2 years, I was able to use my education, my experience, my expertise to truly help someone. Marcus could see tears threatening in her eyes, but her voice stayed steady. When I saw you struggling in that meeting, when I realized I could help, it was like breathing again after holding my breath for 2 years. For a moment, I wasn't just Grace the janitor. I was Dr. Grace Williams again, doing the work I loved. She stood with quiet dignity, hands folded in front of her, waiting for his response. Marcus could see all the pain, all the loss, all the resilience in her posture. He knew her life had been forever changed by meeting this extraordinary woman. Marcus remained silent for a long moment after Grace finished her story, the weight of her words settling on him like a physical revelation. He could feel his own breath, shallow and uneven, as he processed not only the magnitude of the injustice she had suffered but his own part in keeping her invisible. Grace, he began, his voice hoarse with emotion. I don't have words to express how deeply sorry I am, not just for what you went through, but for what I contributed to it. I passed by you every day for months, and I never really saw you. Grace opened her mouth to reply, but Marcus gently raised a hand. No, let me finish. I prided myself on being a good judge of character, on recognizing talent. But I was so blind, so trapped in my own assumptions about who deserves recognition. I saw the uniform, the job title, and I stopped seeing a person. I stopped seeing you. Marcus stood up, beginning to pace behind his desk, nervous energy pulsing through him. What happened to you embodies everything wrong with our system. You were punished not for anything you did wrong, but for being human, for trusting, for being a victim. And then our society, our professional community, failed you completely. Mr. Thompson, Grace started softly. You don't have to. Yes, I do, Marcus interrupted, turning to face her with an intensity that surprised them both. Because what I'm about to say will change everything, and I need you to understand this comes from genuine recognition of who you are and what you can contribute. Grace's eyes widened slightly, uncertainty flickering across her face. Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. Grace, I want to offer you a position. Not just any position. I want you to be our Director of International Relations. The silence that followed was deafening. Grace stared at him, her mouth slightly open, as if the words hadn't quite registered. I don't understand, she whispered. You are exactly what this company needs, Marcus said, his voice growing strong with conviction. Your expertise in international business, your language skills, your understanding of cultural nuances. These are exactly the qualifications we've been looking for. Your experience, your education, your character. All of it makes you not just qualified, but perfectly suited for this role. Grace's hands began to tremble, and she placed them flat on the table to steady herself. Marcus, I appreciate the gesture, but you can't just create a position for me out of pity. Pity, Marcus interrupted sharply, indignation in his voice. Grace, this has nothing to do with pity. This is about recognition, about finally seeing what should have been obvious from the start. You spent years cleaning offices where you could have been leading meetings. You overheard conversations where your expertise could have been invaluable. You stayed invisible while possessing exactly the knowledge our company desperately needs. Tears started to fill Grace's eyes, but she fought them back. But my reputation, the scandal, that will be forgotten, Marcus said firmly. Because anyone who takes the time to really know you, to see your character, your intelligence, your integrity, will understand you were a victim, not a culprit. And anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve to work with you. Grace stood slowly, her legs seeming unsteady beneath her. I haven't worked in my field in 2 years. I don't know if I can. You never stopped working in your field, Marcus corrected gently. You just weren't paid for it. You kept studying, learning, growing. You maintained your skills even when you had no reason to believe you'd ever use them again. That shows a dedication most professionals never demonstrate. For a moment, Grace appeared to struggle within herself. Decades of academic confidence battling years of rejection and invisibility. Marcus could see a change starting in her posture, as if she were slowly remembering who she had been. The salary, Marcus continued, will be $120,000 a year, plus benefits, plus performance bonuses. You'll have your own office, a staff of 3, and complete autonomy over international strategy. Grace's breath caught, and she placed a hand over her mouth. That's more than I made as a tenured professor. It's what you're worth, Marcus said simply. It's what you've always been worth. Suddenly, Grace began to cry. Not quiet tears, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from years of suppressed pain and hope. Marcus started to move toward her, but she held up a hand, gathering herself with visible effort. I'm sorry, she managed through her tears. I had given up. I thought I would clean offices for the rest of my life. You never gave up, Marcus said softly. You kept studying, kept learning, kept hoping. That's not giving up. That's incredible strength. Grace wiped her eyes with tissues from Marcus's desk, slowly regaining her composure. When would you need an answer? I don't need an answer, Marcus replied. I need you to say yes. But I understand if you need time to process this. Grace looked at him for a long moment, studying his face as if searching for any hint of deception or false kindness. Finding none, she straightened her shoulders with the same dignity she'd shown throughout their conversation. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Yes, I accept." Marcus felt a surge of genuine joy, the first real satisfaction he'd felt in months. "Excellent. And Grace, we're going to do this right. I want to tell the staff about this immediately, because I think they need to understand what happened here today." Within 20 minutes, Marcus had assembled his entire staff in the main conference room. Grace sat beside him at the head of the table, having changed from her cleaning uniform into a spare business suit that one of the female executives had provided. Even in borrowed clothes, she carried herself with a quiet authority impossible to ignore. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, his voice carrying through the room, "I want to tell you about a mistake I made and a lesson I learned today. For months, we've been looking for someone to lead our international relations department. We've interviewed dozens of candidates, spent thousands of dollars on headhunters, and never found the right person." He paused, looking around the room at the faces of his employees, most of whom glanced curiously at Grace. "Today I discovered the right person was here all along, working silently, serving this company in a different role, but possessing exactly the expertise we've been searching for." Marcus turned to Grace, his voice warm with respect. "I'd like you to meet Dr. Grace Williams, our new Director of International Relations." A murmur of surprise spread through the room. Marcus could see confusion, curiosity, and dawning recognition on several faces. "Dr. Williams," Marcus continued, "holds a PhD in international business from Columbia University. She's fluent in French, German, and Spanish. She spent 15 years teaching international commerce and conducting research on global trade relations. She's published extensively on European markets and has consulted for Fortune 500 companies." The staff now looked at Grace with completely different eyes, seeing her perhaps for the first time. "For the past several months, you knew Dr. Williams as Grace, a member of our cleaning staff. And that's on me. That's on all of us. We saw a uniform and stopped seeing a person. We made assumptions about worth based on job title rather than character or capability." Marcus's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "Today I learned that true brilliance doesn't shout from corner offices or demand recognition. It serves silently, maintaining dignity, waiting patiently to be seen." Dr. Williams kept studying, learning, and growing even when she had no reason to believe she'd ever use her education again. That's not just professional dedication, that's character. He turned to Grace, who sat with quiet dignity, her hands folded, tears gleaming in her eyes but posture straight and confident. "While we were searching everywhere for the right person, she was here, doing her job with grace and excellence, ready to contribute but never pushing herself forward. Today, when I struggled with a critical international negotiation, she offered help that quite literally saved a multi-million-dollar deal. She didn't ask for recognition or reward. She simply saw a need and tried to help." Marcus scanned the room, making eye contact with each staff member. "I want you all to understand this isn't charity. This isn't pity. This is recognition of exceptional qualifications and character. Dr. Williams is exactly what our company needs, and we're lucky she's agreed to join us in this role." Spontaneous applause began. Tentative at first, then growing stronger as the full impact settled on the room. Grace stood, acknowledging the applause with a gracious nod, her transformation from invisible cleaning woman to respected executive complete in the eyes of everyone present. "Thank you," Grace said, her voice clear and strong. "For the past months, I've had the privilege of serving this company in a different role. I've observed your dedication, your professionalism, and your character. Now I look forward to contributing in a new way, to using my background to help achieve our international goals." She paused, looking warmly around the room. "I want you to know every experience teaches us something valuable. My time cleaning these offices taught me about humility, perseverance, and the importance of seeing value in all honest work. Those lessons will make me a better leader." As the staff began to disperse, many stopping to properly introduce themselves to Grace, Marcus felt a profound sense of satisfaction. He watched Grace shake hands and engage in lively conversations about international markets, her expertise flowing naturally as she discussed currency fluctuations and trade agreements. Later, as the office emptied, Marcus found himself alone with Grace in his office again. She had removed the borrowed jacket and was reviewing some of the international files he'd provided. "So," he said, settling back in his chair, "how does it feel to be Dr. Grace Williams again?" Grace looked up from the documents, a small smile playing on her lips. "It feels like waking up from a very long dream, or maybe waking up from a nightmare into a dream." "You earned this," Marcus said firmly. "Every bit of it." "I know," Grace replied, and Marcus was struck by the quiet confidence in her voice. "Today, for the first time in 2 years, I feel like myself again. Not just a survivor, but a professional. Not just someone who lost everything, but someone who kept her dignity through the worst of times." She stood, gathering the files. "I should go home and prepare. I have a lot of work to do." "Grace," Marcus called as she reached the door. "Thank you for helping me today, yes, but more than that, for reminding me that excellence comes in many forms, and recognition is a responsibility, not a privilege." Grace smiled, an expression of genuine warmth and contentment. "Thank you for seeing me, really seeing me. After 2 years of invisibility, that means everything." As she left, Marcus remained in his chair, reflecting on the day's events. He thought about assumptions and prejudice, about worth and recognition, about the thin line between success and failure we all walk. But mostly, he thought about Grace, who lost everything but never lost herself, who served silently but never stopped growing, who waited patiently for recognition while never compromising her dignity. Today had taught him that true worth isn't always visible, that remarkable people may be hiding in plain sight, and that sometimes the most important business decisions aren't about numbers or profits but about recognizing the human value that has been there all along, quietly waiting to be seen.
If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will also move you. Click to keep watching.